Title: The Silent Engine. In the heart of the Pacific, the USS Valor floated aimlessly, a marvel of modern engineering rendered inert. Despite the presence of the Navy's finest engineers and AI specialists, the ship remained dead in the water, its advanced hybrid propulsion system failing to respond. The tension in the control room was palpable, with Lieutenant Alex Carter standing rigidly, his face pale as he delivered the grim news. "Sir, we've lost propulsion again," he stated, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Captain Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her boots echoing against the metal floor. "Defy again, Lieutenant," she demanded, her tone sharp. Main hybrid unit cycled down. Manual restart failed. "She's not responding to backup protocols either," Carter replied, his voice trembling slightly. Silence enveloped the room, broken only by a low curse from Chief Engineer Mark Thompson, who had been hunched over the diagnostics panel for hours. This was day 3 of what was supposed to be a 5-day classified training exercise, 120 miles off the coast of San Diego. The Valor, a $4.5 billion destroyer, was now a floating relic, devoid of power and purpose. The hybrid propulsion system, designed to be foolproof, had become a source of embarrassment. Months of secrecy surrounded its installation, and only a select few engineers had clearance to work on it. As the crew of 10 engineers, both Navy and civilian, hovered around diagnostic stations, sweat dripped from their brows. Software updates had been pushed, circuit boards replaced, and the AI reinitialized multiple times, yet nothing worked. At 0400 hours, Captain Mitchell made the call. "We're not making any more guesses," she said, pacing in the briefing room. "Someone outside this circle needs to look at this." Commander David Lee, head of the engineering division, shook his head. "That won't sit well with command. They hand-picked this team for a reason." Mitchell met his gaze. "And yet this team hasn't fixed it." She knew the stakes. If word got out that the Valor had failed just weeks after deployment, heads would roll, hers likely first. After a silent chain reaction of calls and emails, the Navy's top propulsion consultants were contacted. One by one, they reviewed the data and declined to intervene. The risk to their reputations was too high. By the start of day 3, morale was plummeting. In the mess hall, conversations dwindled. Petty Officer Emma Reed, usually the life of the party, barely spoke. A sense of failure wrapped around the ship like a thick fog. Admiral Robert Hayes received the update at precisely 0800 hours. He sat in his office at Naval Base Point Loma, reading through the latest diagnostics and field reports. "Get me Samuel Grant," he said, not looking up from his tablet. His assistant hesitated. "You heard me. I don't care where he is. Find him." Samuel Grant had been out of the Navy for nearly a decade, retiring quietly without ceremony. But Hayes remembered him. A day in the Gulf when an entire power grid nearly collapsed, and Grant rerouted the entire system using nothing but a wrench and a sketchbook. He didn't need AI or theory. He listened to machines. Back on the Valor, Captain Mitchell stood at the edge of the deck, staring out at the restless sea. Then her calm crackled to life. "Captain, command has greenlit a consultant. Civilian status. Coming in under emergency clearance. Ite 5 hours." She raised an eyebrow. "Name?" "Samuel Grant." Mitchell turned and walked back inside, her mind racing. 5 hours on a ship that felt like it had given up was longer than anyone wanted to admit. The engines weren't the only thing that had shut down. As the third day hit its midpoint, the Valor felt more like a ghost ship than a warship. The air was thick with frustration. Down in the engine room, the smell of burnt rubber lingered from the last emergency reset. The system had blown another fuse overnight, and the main console sat dark, the onboard AI looping in diagnostics purgatory. "We're missing something fundamental," Commander Lee muttered, crouched next to the power grid access panel. Beside him, civilian contractor Miachin scrolled through code on her tablet, frowning. "We're looking at this through the lens of perfection. The system was designed in a lab, but ships don't live in labs." Lee sighed. "I know. We need someone who understands chaos." Just then, The announcement came to the internal comms. A civilian consultant was en route under high-priority clearance, arrival scheduled by chopper within the hour. Most of the crew had no idea what that meant. Some assumed it was another tech genius with a fresh algorithm. Others joked that maybe the president was sending Elon Musk. Only Captain Mitchell and a few senior staff knew the name Samuel Grant. When the Black Hawk touched down on the makeshift helipad, the man who stepped off wore worn boots, a faded Navy windbreaker, and a face lined with the marks of time and experience. In his left hand, he held a notebook that looked like it had traveled through several wars. "Is this the guy?" Chief Thompson squinted. Grant didn't respond. He glanced at the crew waiting to greet him and simply said, "Where's the engine room?" They walked in silence, the sound of boots echoing against the bulkheads. As they descended through the levels, Grant asked just 3 questions. "What's she running?" "G hydrocore hybrid system," Mia replied. "Last gen code with a semi-autonomous diagnostic shell." Lee added, "What's she not doing?" Grant asked. "Everything," Lee muttered. Grant stopped just outside the engine room door, listening to the faint vibrations in the walls. He nodded once. "Don't touch anything until I've heard her." Inside, the crew stood back, unsure whether to feel hope or irritation. Grant bent over slightly, placing the stethoscope against a junction pipe. He stood still, eyes closed, breath steady. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. Nearly a full minute went by before Grant straightened up and asked, "Who adjusted the heatsink capacitors after the shutdown?" A young Navy mechanic raised her hand hesitantly. "I did," following the default sequence. Grant shook his head. "You followed it wrong. Not your fault. The sequence was designed for clean installs, not for a hot core mid-cycle failure." He looked at Lee. "You're trying to restart a system that's fighting itself. Because you're overriding the original failsafe. She's locking you out because she's not broken. She's in defense mode." A long silence followed. Mia muttered, "I didn't even think that was possible." Grant scratched something in his notebook. "Most don't. Not unless you've seen the system in its first form, before they put AI on top of it. This machine's not just complex. She's scared. You've been yelling at her. I'm just here to speak her language." As the engineers began rewiring under Grant's guidance, Captain Mitchell watched, intrigued. A man with no access badge, no degrees hanging on a wall, and no patience for theory was taking control of a ship too advanced for its own designers. 7 years earlier, Samuel Grant had turned his badge and walked away from the USS Liberty without a ceremony. He didn't do retirement speeches or keep up with Navy politics. He spent his days in a small garage in Norfolk, working on old outboard motors and broken tools, somehow always making them run. That morning, Grant had been working on a 1975 Johnson V4 outboard when his phone rang. He wiped his hands, glanced at the caller ID, and muttered, "Too early for recruiters." He answered anyway. "This is Samuel." A pause. "Chief Grant, this is Admiral Robert Hayes. You remember me?" Letty N.D. July 20th, 2025, 10:47. Grant froze for a moment, not out of fear, but out of memory. "I remember," he replied, his voice gravelly. "I need you," Hayes said. "The Valor's down. She's not responding to anyone. Civilian contractors, engineers, AI coders. We've thrown everything at her, and nothing's worked." Grant didn't answer right away. He looked down at the grease on his hands, rubbed it against a rag, and thought about the ship that had once made headlines as the Navy's smartest vessel. "I've read about her," he finally replied. "She's not just stuck. She's drowning," Hayes said. Grant leaned against the wall of his garage. "You've got 200 engineers at your disposal. What the hell do you need me for?" Hayes' tone shifted, almost vulnerable. "Because they're all trying to outthink the system. I need someone who can feel it." Grant laughed dryly. "What is this? A motivational speech? I'm a mechanic, not a prophet." Hayes didn't flinch. "You're the only one who's seen the bones of the system before it got wrapped in AI and algorithms. Before the Navy made it too smart to understand." Another pause. Grant stared at the notebook sitting on his workbench, full of engine diagrams and field notes. "I don't wear the uniform anymore, Robert. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to help us fix a mistake. A mistake we're all too proud to admit we made. Grant didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He simply hung up. 10 minutes later, he called back. You got a bird ready? Already warming up, Hayes replied. By the time the helicopter landed on the Valor, word had spread through the upper levels of Naval Command. Some questioned Hayes' judgment. Others were curious. An old chief with no clearance codes, no digital credentials, and no current certifications was being flown onto a billion-dollar ship to fix a problem that had stumped every expert in the Department of Defense. But Hayes didn't care. He remembered a man who once patched an engine blindfolded during a blackout in the Gulf, who used the sound of engine vibrations to map out a fractured power shaft before it snapped completely. He remembered what Samuel Grant could do, not because he was gifted, but because he listened harder than anyone else. On board the Valor, skepticism was heavy. Lieutenant Carter was the first to speak when the chopper was heard. You think this guy is going to be the answer? Commander Lee gave a weak shrug. At this point, I'd settle for a janitor with a flashlight if it gets us off this grid. When Samuel Grant stepped onto the deck, eyes followed him, not out of awe, but curiosity. Who was this man carrying nothing but a notebook and an old stethoscope? Captain Mitchell met him in the hatch, her voice firm but respectful. Chief Grant, I've read your file. We appreciate you coming. Grant looked her square in the eyes. I didn't come for the Navy. I came for the ship. She blinked. Fair enough. But nobody knew just how personal that statement really was. Inside the engine room, Grant stopped at the threshold. 10 engineers were inside, standing in a semicircle around the silent hybrid core. A few glanced up, clearly skeptical. One of them, a tall civilian in a clean tech vest, leaned over to a colleague and whispered, "They sent us a janitor." Grant caught the comment, but didn't flinch. He stepped forward, set his notebook on a nearby ledge, and walked up to the dead machine. "Where was the last pulse?" he asked, turning to Commander Lee. "Sector B7. Voltage collapsed during reinitialization," Lee replied. Grant moved slowly, tapping the outer casing with the handle of his wrench. He listened, then moved 5 steps to the left, bent down, and placed a stethoscope on a junction node. The engineers exchanged glances. A few smirked. One even chuckled under his breath. Grant didn't care. He stayed there, crouched for nearly 30 seconds, eyes closed, breathing steady. Finally, he stood up, turned around, and pointed at a row of components near the cooling relay. "That's the wrong capacitor type." The room went still. Mia stepped forward. "That's impossible. We double-checked it against the design specs." Grant replied, "You check what the computer told you to check, but not what the ship was built with. That relay model was switched out during prototype testing. It creates a voltage echo when paired with the core interface. Can't be read by the AI because the algorithm doesn't know what it's looking at." Lee frowned. That was never in the manual. Grant walked over and peeled back the side panel, revealing a small charred piece of metal. Because the manual was written after the system got sanitized for production. "I saw this exact failure once in '08 on a test platform. They buried it." The smirks faded. Captain Mitchell folded her arms. "Can it be fixed?" Grant looked at her. "You got solder and a part we can cannibalize from the comm relay housing?" She hesitated. "That's not regulation." Grant tilted his head. "Neither is being dead in the water for 4 days." She nodded once. "Do it." As the engineers scrambled to follow his lead, no one realized how close they had come to a total systems collapse. Grant didn't work fast. He worked right. The other engineers, used to rushing under pressure, hovered impatiently as he sat cross-legged on the floor, laying out tools from a small canvas pouch. His hands moved with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades listening to machines in distress. "Pull the relay from comms housing," he said to a young technician. "But don't touch the shielding. It's brittle. You break it, it's useless." The kid, Petty Officer Jake Morris, nodded. "Yes, sir." "Not sir, just Samuel," Grant replied. Morris smiled faintly, disappearing around the corner. Commander Lee paced nearby. "So you really think one outdated capacitor is the whole issue?" Grant looked up. "No, I think it's where the problem started. The rest is just everything else reacting to bad information. He grabbed the old capacitor, still warm from being overworked, and placed it next to the new one. This is what I've been saying for 2 days. Mia spoke up. This system isn't failing. It's rejecting something. Exactly, Grant said. She's trying to protect herself. Every time you restart her, you're making her think she's under attack. Captain Mitchell had joined them again, arms behind her back, silent but focused. Grant continued. The AI in these newer systems doesn't just obey. It evaluates. If something doesn't make sense, it shuts down as a defensive response. No logic tree is going to fix that. You got to fix the logic it thinks is real. Morris returned with the salvage part, holding it like it was a raw egg. Grant nodded. Perfect. He took the replacement, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work. No gloves, no diagrams, just a man and a machine talking a language only they understood. Wires were clipped, contacts cleaned, and the soldering iron hissed as the metal melted into place. The smell hit. A sharp electric tang that made everyone in the room pause. It was a smell of repair, of risk, of one last shot. When he finished, Grant leaned back and wiped his hands on a rag. All right, he said. Cycle the primary. Don't push it. Let her come back on her own. Commander Lee took a breath. Restarting system now. The lights flickered. A low vibration rolled through the floor like distant thunder. Then nothing. Everyone stared. Grant didn't react. He stepped forward, pressed a stethoscope to the main coil casing, and listened. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then a low click echoed from the panel. The diagnostic screen lit up, dim at first, then stable, then bright. Core temperature stabilizing, Mia said, eyes locked on her tablet. Auxiliary relays responding, Lee added. Propulsion interface online, Morris said, his voice climbing with hope. The entire engine room stood still, afraid to speak too loud, like they might scare back into silence. Captain Mitchell broke the moment. Mr. Grant, what did you do? Grant shrugged, giving her something she could trust. She was trying to run on a frequency that didn't match her memory. Now she's back in tune. Mitchell looked at the panel, watching as system after system tick green. Unbelievable, she muttered. One of the younger engineers, a smug-faced tech named Riley Brooks, crossed his arms. This doesn't make sense. How do you know what to check? There's no way you just guessed that. Grant turned to him. I didn't guess. I listened. Brooks scoffed. It's a machine. You can't listen to metal and wires. Grant took a step toward him, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance. Even you ever watch someone bleed out from a pressure burst because the cooling system failed at the wrong second? You ever crawl into a pipe chase with 40 seconds of oxygen left because a valve you knew was going to fail finally did? Brooks said nothing. The room stayed quiet. Grant turned back to the engine and gave it a gentle knock. She's alive. Let her breathe. For the first time in nearly 4 days, the Valor hummed. Not weakly, not glitching, just steady, honest, real. Outside on the open sea, the ship began to move again. But the questions weren't over. Once a ship like this fails, command starts asking what else might break. The USS Valor didn't lurch forward. She didn't jolt or groan or make a dramatic noise. When she came back online, she glided, slow at first, barely noticeable movement beneath their boots. But it was enough. The engines had sunk. The propulsion interface was holding steady, and the AI had stopped throwing error codes. Inside the control room, Lieutenant Carter leaned forward in his seat, hands hovering over the console, like he didn't trust what he was seeing. Sir, we're moving, he said softly, not taking his eyes off the screen. Captain Mitchell stood behind him, arms folded, jaw tight. How fast? 0.8 knots. No drag. Power curves climbing back toward normal parameters. She's stabilizing. Commander Lee exhaled for what felt like the first time in a week. Down in the engine room, the silence that followed the restart was filled with restrained disbelief. For a few seconds, no one said a word. Then, as the systems reported green one after another, a slow ripple of applause started from Morris, then Mia, then even Lee. Samuel Grant didn't clap. He just watched the diagnostic panel until the final warning light disappeared. Then he closed his notebook. "I've seen worse," he muttered. Captain Mitchell came down the ladder into the room, her eyes scanning every face before locking on Grant. "You did something no one else could." We were almost ready to tug her back to shore. Grant shook his head. "You'd have dragged back a dead machine. Might have looked good from the outside, but she'd never run right again." Mitchell looked around at the crew, still trying to wrap their heads around what just happened. How we miss it. Every expert, every protocol. Grant leaned against the wall, wiping his hands. "Because you stopped listening. These ships, they're not just wires and code. They've got rhythm, history. And once something's out of tune, the system doesn't care how smart your AI is. It's still wrong." Mitchell gave a slight nod. "That relay issue, you really saw it before?" USS Liberty, 2008. Prototype install. Same model, same echo loop. Mia spoke up from the side. "But the system specs were changed since then." "Specs change. Physics don't." Lee leaned in, watching Grant closely. "You said earlier the system was scared, that it was defending itself. You meant that literally?" Grant shrugged. "As literal as a machine can be. You give something enough inputs, it starts to draw its own conclusions." There was a pause. It wasn't awkward, just thoughtful. The kind that settles over a room when people realize they've been doing something wrong for longer than they want to admit. Mitchell broke the silence. "You saved this ship. You saved all of us." Grant didn't flinch at the praise. "I didn't save anyone. I just gave her a second chance." Lee stepped forward. "So what now? Do we need to rewrite the entire diagnostic protocol?" Grant smiled, just barely. "Or you teach the next guy to use a stethoscope once in a while." The engineers laughed, not mockingly, but with real relief. It wasn't just a restart. It was knowing the nightmare might finally be over. Grant reached for the bundle he'd set aside earlier, the cloth that held the old wrench from his father. He tucked it into his jacket pocket. He wasn't going to stay long. He knew that. His job was never about staying. It was about getting the system moving again and then stepping aside. Captain Mitchell walked with him as he headed back toward the deck. "You didn't have to come, you know," she said. "You could have said no." "I almost did." "So, why didn't you—" Grant paused at the door, looking back toward the engine room. "Because when a ship calls for help, someone should answer." But not everyone saw this as a win. Some back at command were already questioning how this failure happened at all, and the answers weren't going to be comfortable. The Valor was moving again, but not everyone was celebrating. Hours after the restart, while the crew regained their rhythm and systems returned to full function, a different kind of tension began to take shape, not technical, but political. Back at Naval Base Point Loma, reports had already been filed. Senior officers began asking uncomfortable questions. Why did one of the Navy's most advanced destroyers go down during a controlled training exercise? Why did the failure go undetected by diagnostic AI? Why did it take a retired chief with no clearance and no current credentials to fix a multi-billion-dollar ship? And maybe most pressing of all, who was responsible? Captain Mitchell had already received 2 encrypted messages marked urgent review. They weren't congratulating her. They were asking for explanations. Down on the lower deck, in a smaller briefing room with coffee-stained chairs and buzzing overhead lights, a private meeting had been called. Commander Lee, Lieutenant Carter, Civilian Systems Engineer Mia Chun, and Samuel Grant sat around the table. Carter leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I'm just saying we all need to be aligned before this goes upstairs." "Aligned?" Grant repeated, not looking up from his notebook. Carter shifted. "There's already chatter about protocol violations. Pulling hardware from comms, bypassing standard procedures, no documentation. If someone decides this was a liability instead of fix, we're the ones on the line." Mia spoke up. "He's right. Even though it worked, technically everything we did could be flagged. Samuel isn't even under contract. This whole thing could get spun wrong." Grant closed a notebook and set it on the table. "You know what gets people hurt?" he asked, his voice calm, worrying more about paperwork than problems. Lee rubbed his temples. "He's got a point, but we're not debating whether it worked. We're debating how to protect it from being used against us. Grant leaned back, fatigue washing over him, not physical, but deeper. I've been fixing ships longer than some of you have been alive. I've crawled through fire suppression failures, chewed through carbon buildup with a butter knife, and repaired cooling lines while a ship listed 20 degrees to port in the middle of a storm. You know what I never needed? A permission slip. Outside the room, footsteps echoed down the hall. Captain Mitchell entered, holding a tablet. They want me on a secure line in 10, she said. They're already spinning this as a systems anomaly. Some of the upper brass are trying to downplay the issue entirely. Grant raised an eyebrow. Of course they are. Mitchell looked at him carefully. They're also asking how an uncredentialed civilian was allowed access to propulsion core. Grant gave a tired smile. Tell them I brought donuts. She almost smiled back. Almost. He stepped closer. You want the truth in your report? Say the ship was down. Say every expert failed. And say an old man walked on, listened, and fixed it. Because that's what happened. Don't lie to protect me. Don't lie to protect them. Tell the truth. Let them choke on it if they have to. Mitchell nodded. You'll be off the ship within the hour. Transport's already inbound. Grant didn't argue. He just glanced once more toward the direction of the engine room. The hum was steady now. The ship was breathing. He turned back. She's strong again. That's all I care about. But before Grant left, someone unexpected stopped him with a question that would change how he viewed what he'd just done. He was halfway to the landing pad when he heard the voice. Mr. Grant, wait. He turned to see Petty Officer Jake Morris jogging toward him, a bit out of breath, holding something in his hands. Grant slowed. What is it? Morris stopped just short of him and held up the worn notebook. You left this in the briefing room. Grant took it, gave it a quick glance, and slipped it under his arm. Appreciate it. Morris didn't move. There was a hesitation in his face, like he wanted to ask something, but wasn't sure if he had the right. You all right? Grant asked. Morris nodded slowly, then blurted out, How did you know? Not just the part about the capacitor, but the way the whole system would respond. None of that's in any of our training. Grant looked him in the eye. Because you can't program instinct. He waited to see if Morris understood. The young sailor's brow furrowed, and Grant softened his tone. You've been taught how the system should work. That's good, but you also got to learn what they do when they don't. Machines don't always follow instructions. Sometimes they react. Sometimes they hide what's broken. You got to learn their habits, not just their blueprints. Morris listened like he was hearing something no one had told him before. Do you think I could learn that? He asked. Grant paused. That kind of question didn't come easy for most men, especially not on a warship. Especially not to someone they barely knew. You just did, Grant said. You watched me listen instead of guess. You paid attention. Next time something breaks, do the same. Get quiet. Don't rush. Let the machine tell you what's wrong. Morris nodded, almost reverently. Thank you, sir. Just Samuel, Grant replied, clapping him gently on the shoulder. Keep asking hard questions, even when you think you're not supposed to. A few minutes later, Grant stood by the open door of the transport chopper. Captain Mitchell approached. No formalities this time. She looked different, less rigid, more human. I've been thinking about what you said, she began. Which part? He asked, half smiling. The part about listening. I've spent so much time trusting screens, readouts, reports, I forgot what it meant to actually listen to what's real. Grant nodded. It's easy to forget. You're surrounded by people telling you the ship's fine, the numbers are right, but ships lie sometimes. Just like people. She looked out toward the ocean. What happens to all of that when people like you stop showing up? Grant thought about that. Really thought about it. You hope somebody else remembers. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not even next month. But eventually, someone finds your notebook, or they ask the right question at the wrong time, or they screw something up so badly, they have to do what I did. Go back to the beginning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old wrench. He andied it to her, without a word. Mitchell hesitated. I can't take that. It's not for you, Grant said. It's for the next sailor who thinks they're too young to be right and too old to still be learning. Keep it somewhere no one touches. Just don't forget where it came from. She held the wrench like it was something sacred. The chopper's blade started turning. Grant climbed in, then turned one last time. You've got a good ship, Captain. She's just not as shiny as she wants to be. Mitchell smiled. Neither are most of us. The transport lifted off, sending sea spray across the deck. Granton looked down. He didn't need to. The ship was fixed. The story would either be buried in paperwork or whispered down hallways, but the Valor would keep going. That was enough. In his lap, the notebook stayed closed, but his mind wasn't. The truth was, he wasn't just fixing engines. He was leaving behind a different kind of map. One written in mistakes, corrections, quiet decisions, and unspoken rules. But back home in Norfolk, something was already waiting that would remind Grant his work wasn't finished. Not yet. 2 days later, Samuel Grant was back in Norfolk. Same garage, same tools, same rusted fan pushing warm air across the room like it was trying to quit. He was elbow deep in the guts of an old Vinroot engine, sleeves rolled up, radio murmuring low in the background. It was like he'd never left, except something had changed. The call came mid-morning. Not from Hayes, not from the Navy, but from someone else entirely. Mr. Grant, this is Commander Lien Cho. I'm heading up a training revision task force at the Naval Engineering School in Gulfport. Your name's been surfacing. Grant wiped his hands, sat down on the nearest stool, and waited. I'm not recruiting, she said quickly. I know you're done. I heard what you did on the Valor, and I was hoping you'd be willing to talk to some of our trainees. Informally. Not a lecture, just a conversation about what doesn't make it into manuals. Grant didn't respond right away. Commander Cho filled the silence. We've got smart kids, but they're being trained by systems that assume they'll never need to go off script, that the ship will tell them everything. But sometimes it lies. I think you might be the only one left who knows what that looks like. He leaned back, looking at the ceiling of his garage. One of the tiles was stained brown from an old leak that had never been fixed. It had been there for years. He used to find it ugly. Now it just looked honest. I'll think about it, he said finally. She didn't push. That's all I ask. After they hung up, Grant stood in the doorway, looking out over the street. A city bus passed. A kid on a bike weaved between parked cars. Normal life. And yet, in the back of his mind, the Valor was still there, humming. That afternoon, he did something he hadn't done in years. He took out a clean notebook, blank pages, no stains, no bent corners, and at the top of the first page he wrote, "Things the ship won't tell you." Below that, he began listing them. Not technical specs, not procedures, just truths. The sound of a relay right before it dies isn't sharp. It's sluggish. If a pump surges 3 times in 10 seconds, shut it down. The 4th surge means someone gets hurt. Don't trust a screen until you've touched the wire behind it. If the ship feels different, it probably is. By the end of the day, 5 pages were filled, not with instruction, but with memory. The next morning, a package arrived, no return address. Inside was a photo of the engine room of the Valor post-repair. On the wall, mounted in a shadow box, was the old wrench. A plaque underneath read, "This tool once stopped a warship from going silent." Grant smiled. Later that week, he agreed to meet Commander Cho's trainees. Not at a podium, but in the corner of a hangar, folding chairs in a loose circle. He didn't bring slides or charts, just that notebook and the same tired hands that still knew how to listen. One of the young trainees asked, "What's the most important thing you ever fix?" Grant paused. He could have said the Valor or the blackout in the Gulf, or that emergency bypass he built from scavenged parts in '97. But instead, he said, "My patience." The room went quiet, not from confusion, but understanding. "You'll panic one day," he told them. "You'll hear a sound you don't recognize, and the ship will stop responding. And everyone will look at you. Not the computer, not the manual, just you. And if you let the panic talk first, you'll miss what the machine's really saying." He closed the notebook and tapped it gently. "The good ones!" They listened twice before they touched anything. The trainees nodded slowly, eyes locked on him like every word was a rope they wanted to hold on to. When the session ended, one of them, a young woman with grease still on her coveralls, waited until the others left. She asked, "Do you think machines remember us?" Grant chuckled. "Maybe. But the better question is, will you remember them?" He left her with a notebook. Not the new one, but the original, yellowed, wrinkled, full of smudged ink and fingerprints from decades of work. "Copy what you want," he said, "but only if you plan to add to it." That night, back in Norfolk, Grant sat in his chair with the radio low and the wrench now missing from its usual spot. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt useful again. Because sometimes what we leave behind isn't just tools or notes. It's the habit of listening when no one else does. If this story moved you, share it. Tell someone who's forgotten the value of experience. And if you ever feel like your time has passed, remember, the next generation might still be waiting for your voice.